What if I told you that in the year 1350, something as simple as walking up a flight of stairs with the wrong foot could get you executed on the spot? You've seen the movies, the brave knights, the beautiful queens, and the majestic stone towers. But the reality of living inside a medieval castle was far from a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes game of survival where the architecture itself was designed to kill you, and the rules were written in blood. I'm talking about laws so bizarre and secrets so dark that they've been scrubbed from the history books. From the death traps hidden in plain sight to the terrifying silence laws, today we're uncovering the strange medieval castle rules that could get you killed. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll realize why a castle was the last place on Earth you'd ever want to call home. Let's start with the very floor beneath your feet. In a medieval fortress, the stairs were never just stairs. If you ever visit a castle like Warwick or the Tower of London, look closely at the spiral staircases. They all wind clockwise. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a brutal defensive tactic. Since most people are right-handed, a defender coming down the stairs had his sword arm free to swing, but an attacker coming up, his sword arm would be constantly hitting the central stone pillar. But here's the rule that killed the innocent: the trip step. Architects built one or two steps at random intervals slightly higher than the rest. If you were a guest or a servant and you stumbled, the guards wouldn't catch you, they'd kill you. Why? Because only someone who didn't belong there, someone who hadn't memorized the rhythm of the castle, would trip. Stumbling was seen as proof that you were an infiltrator. One wrong step and a spear would be through your chest before you could say sorry. Now, imagine being invited to a royal feast. You're hungry, the smell of roasted meat is in the air, and you think you're safe. You couldn't be more wrong. The Great Hall was a minefield of social execution. There was a rule known as the salt line. A large container of salt sat in the middle of the table. If you were seated below the salt, you were practically invisible. But the real danger was for those above the salt. At a lord's table, whispering was strictly forbidden. In an era where paranoia ran deep and poison was the preferred weapon of the elite, a whisper was considered a death warrant. If the Lord of Misrule caught you leaning toward your neighbor's ear, you wouldn't be asked to leave. You'd be dragged to the oubliette, a French term for a dungeon that literally means the place to be forgotten. It was a deep, dark hole in the ground where prisoners were thrown and left to starve in total darkness. And speaking of food, let's talk about the tasters. We've all heard of food tasters, but the rules governing them were insane. It wasn't just about taking a bite. A taster had to perform the assay, a ritual where they rubbed every piece of bread and every cup of wine against their skin first. If the Lord felt a slight stomachache later that night, even if it was just indigestion, the taster was immediately executed. It was a job where you were essentially scheduled for death. It was just a matter of which meal would be your last. As the sun went down, the castle transformed into something even more sinister. There was a rule called the Lord's Silence. During times of tension or siege, a total noise curfew was enforced. But this wasn't just about being quiet. In some castles, it was a capital offense for a dog to bark or even a baby to cry after the evening bell. There are chilling accounts of mothers being forced to hide in the deepest, dampest cellars, knowing that if their infant made a single sound, the silence wardens would toss the entire family over the battlements to keep the castle pure from noise. The fear was that sound carried through the stone walls, potentially signaling to enemies outside or masking the sound of tunnelers digging beneath the foundations. Let's talk about something truly disgusting: the garderobe. This was the medieval toilet, a simple hole over a vertical shaft. You'd think this was a place for a moment of peace, but it was actually one of the most dangerous spots in the castle. Assassins, known as night creepers, would actually climb up through the waste shafts from the moat to enter the castle. Because of this, guards were ordered to stab the shafts at random intervals with long pikes. If you stayed too long in the garderobe, or if you were there at the wrong time, you risked being impaled from below. There is a famous historical account of a king being murdered exactly this way. In a castle, even your most private moments were a gamble with death. And then there was the law of the night watch. Sentries were under a terrifying order: never look into the dead spaces. These were the unlit, pitch-black corners of the inner courtyard. Medieval people were deeply superstitious, and it was believed that the stone of the castle inhaled the souls of those who died within its walls. If a guard was caught staring into the shadows instead of watching the horizon, he was accused of inviting the shadows in. The punishment was immurement. The guard would be placed inside a small gap in the wall, and masons would brick it up while he was still alive. They believed his living spirit would then act as a permanent guardian for that section of the wall. The curfew was perhaps the most strictly enforced rule of all. The word comes from couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. When the bell rang, every single spark in the castle had to be extinguished. Fire was the greatest enemy of a castle, not just because of the flames, but because a single candle in a window could be a signal to a spy in the woods. If a guard saw a light in your room after the bell, they wouldn't knock. They would burn the room with you inside it to contain the treason. As we look at these grand ruins today, it's easy to get lost in the romance of it all. But remember, these walls weren't built for comfort. They were built for control. Every stone, every staircase, and every rule was designed to remind you that your life belonged to the lord of the castle. The next time you walk through a stone archway or look up at battlements, listen closely. You might just hear the echoes of the thousands who fell victim to the rules that turned these fortresses into beautiful, stone-cold graveyards. Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into the dark side of history that they don't teach you in school, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep your eyes open and stay safe.